Hello, I am Tim Brady, author of A Light in the Northern Sea, a new book from my publisher, Kensington Press, and this is a resistance story and a rescue story of the Jews of Denmark in World War II. The story begins on April 9th, 1940, when German forces rolled into Denmark through the province of Jutland. They faced little opposition from the few Danish forces gathered there to stop them. You can see this photo. The forces hardly looked fierce, but that's who the Germans encountered when they rolled into Denmark initially. In fact, Denmark as a nation had made little effort at defending itself against a German invasion that was largely predictable. Germany also set loose troops in the heart of Copenhagen. The troop ship arrived and docked at the port of Copenhagen at the Lingelinde Pier the night before the invasion. Soldiers poured from the holds of the ship and quickly took command of the nearby Danish citadel, which contained the King's Royal Guard, which was intended to keep the monarch safe from just such incursions. Elsewhere, paratroops landed in Denmark to secure an airport needed by the Germans for the invasion of Norway, which was to come. Taking Denmark was not a long process. There were just a few instances of armed resistance from the Danes in Jutland, which was home to a large number of ethnic Germans, some of whom were actually happy to see Germany's arrival, and in some cases helped guide the Wehrmacht toward Fyn, the island province between Jutland and Zealand, home of Copenhagen. Here's a map of Denmark to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Jutland you can see in Denmark, it's that peninsula that runs from Germany up towards Sweden and Norway and the North Sea. Fyn is the island between Zealand on the eastern part of the map where Copenhagen rests. The two provinces of Jutland that the Germany ran through were Schleswig and Holstein, which were disputed territories which had gone back and forth between Denmark and Germany since the mid-19th century. This is a map of Copenhagen, in which you'll see some of the places that I have indicated already. Towards the top of the map, you'll see the Castellet, which was the armory and the protecting the king, and Langelin is the pier where the German boat docked. The king had a number of castles, Rosenborg, Amalienborg, and Christianborg Castle. Denmark quickly acquiesced to German demands. Within 2 hours of the occupation, King Christian X had called a meeting of the parliamentary, diplomatic, and military leaders of the country, who agreed that battling German forces would simply lead to a bloodbath for Danish resistors. Germany was to serve as the protectorate of Denmark, guarding it from the aims of Allied forces, according to the new agreement. The king and parliament would continue to run Denmark with its legal and police systems still intact. Even its military would continue to exist, and importantly to the Danish people, leery of German intentions and its recent history with its own people, Danish civil liberties were to be upheld. Denmark was a country that had been at peace for almost 80 years. They had stayed neutral through the First World War and wanted to remain that way through a second conflagration. It was well aware of Germany's military might and knew any fighting with its neighbor to the south would likely lead to a conflict which it could not win. Even when its neighbor to the north, Norway, led by a king, Haakon, who was an actual brother to Denmark's own Christian, Norwegian Christian opted to fight Germany, Denmark couldn't be persuaded to join in the battle. And so it was that Denmark slid into its own occupation by Germany. Its people were left in the condition that was somewhat between discomfort and, as time passed, a growing resistance. Patriotic movements like a national phenomenon called Alsang, which saw communities gather publicly to enjoy group sing-alongs of patriotic Danish songs, served to boost the national spirit. And the ongoing presence of the aging king taking daily rides through Copenhagen streets filled with German soldiers also lifted morale. He became a symbol of the independent spirit of the nation, even in light of its occupation. For many Danes, the patriotic response was not enough. Jørgen Keeler and his sister Elsebeth lived in an apartment near the heart of Copenhagen on Øresund Strait. Like much of central Copenhagen, they went down to the center of the city in a state of shock after the occupation, watching as German planes flew overhead, dropping leaflets telling of the takeover. The announcement that the government had agreed to German stipulations in the governance of Denmark was heart-sinking. The Keelers had grown up in Øresund, a city near the center of the province of Jutland. Their father was a doctor, and Jørgen and a brother Flemming would both study medicine at the University of Copenhagen. Elsebeth and a fourth sibling, Bente, would study literature at university. The Keelers typified a type of Danish response to the occupation. They were intellectual and well-traveled. The whole family had visited Germany when they were younger, and Jørgen had not only studied there, but lived with a German family for a year during the rise of Hitler, and had actually listened to a speech given by the Führer in Berlin. He and the rest of the family had few illusions about what German occupation could mean for the Danes. Jørgen was a half-hearted participant in the patriotic movements that took place in the months after the occupation. Instead, he felt a sense of shame that Denmark had given up its stature as a free nation to become a protectorate of Germany. Within him, Elsebeth, Flemming, and Bente was a sense of animus that grew daily through the occupation. As with other Danes, it would ultimately fester into fierce resistance to the German occupiers and all that they stood for. The Jews of Denmark, well aware of Germany and Hitler's fierce anti-Semitism, lived uneasily between an urge towards resistance and the reality of their circumstances as a minority despised by the occupying power. The dangers of making themselves a more visible presence to the Germans through any kind of protest was an obvious structure for their community. There were just 8,000 Jews in Denmark at the time of the occupation. The Jews had arrived in the country by invitation of King Christian IV in the 17th century. They lived primarily in Copenhagen. In 1814, the Jews of Denmark were granted the full rights of citizenship by the king. The Great Synagogue of Copenhagen was constructed a few years later in 1833. Built in the heart of the city, right among the great landmarks of the nation, king's castles, the University of Copenhagen, the statue of the Little Mermaid, Christian X actually participated in the 100th anniversary of the building of the synagogue in 1933. Anti-Semitism was present in Denmark, but it's safe to say it wasn't as virulent as it was in other parts of Europe, though there were few efforts to open the doors to Jewish refugees in the early years of the Third Reich. Jews relied on the assurances from the Danish government that their civil rights would be protected. They trusted that the Danish government would look out for them. They had faith in what they considered to be a Danish way of life, within which the freedoms of citizenship was of paramount importance. For the first years of the occupation, Germany kept its promise of respecting the rights of Denmark's Jews, and the Danish government continued to protect those rights, even as Berlin kept referring to the ongoing Jewish problem in Denmark. The intensity of that problem kept creeping upward, especially after Germany had begun to round up the populations of Jews in Western Europe in 1942. The general population in Denmark likewise trusted its government to look after their civil rights. In fact, a majority of Danes initially agreed with what came to be called the policy of cooperation, which prevailed in regard to Germany. Ordinary Danes did business with Germans, and more than a few did quite well by these exchanges. Danish farms supplied Germany with milk, cheese, pork, and other agricultural products, and its industry sent its goods and labor. But there were others embarrassed by these transactions in light of the destruction that was happening elsewhere in Western Europe. They began to imagine ways to resist the occupation. One of the first groups to do so was formed from the Danish military. These were junior officers brought together from the various branches of the Danish armed forces and nicknamed the Little Princes, who were privy to military intelligence, which they hoped to pass on to the Allies. In Britain, an organization called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was formed at the encouragement of Winston Churchill to assist resistance movements all across Europe. The Little Princes soon sought them out. Ebba Munch, a well-known Danish journalist based in Stockholm, Sweden, was also sought out by the princes and soon agreed to be a go-between to pass military intelligence from the Danish officers to the SOE. Many other Danes began to develop sympathies towards the resistance efforts, even if their actual work for the cause was still months from coming to fruition. Henny Sinding was a teenage sailing champion when Germany occupied her native land. She would have had a hard time imagining herself one day soon shepherding Jewish refugees to safety in fishing boats across the strait that separated Denmark from Sweden. Jens Lilleland was an employee of the American company NCR, a cash register salesman, when he got involved in the Danish resistance. He would go on to become a founding member of Holger Danske, one of the first, most active, and longest-lived resistance groups in Denmark's World War II. Lilleland became attached to Holger Danske through frequent visits to a client of his, a radio store on Istedgade Street in Copenhagen called Stern Radio. The shop, its owners, and several employees within were founding members of the Holger Danske group in Copenhagen, which was named for a mythical Danish hero from the Middle Ages. Members of the group soon began to plot serious attacks against the occupiers, even as loudspeakers placed outside the stop played Allied news from the BBC and favorite World War II Allied songs to goad German troops lingering on the streets outside. Through the course of 1943, resistance efforts from a number of groups, some supported by the SOE, began to become a serious problem for the Germans, inspired by the fact that the Allies, including the Soviet Union, were beginning to make serious inroads into German territory on the Eastern Front, and in Italy, the tide of war is soon to be turning in favor of the Allies. The number of resistors in Denmark grew and became more and more problematic for the Germans until August 1943. Holger Danske placed a bomb in the midst of Copenhagen exhibition hall that was in the process of being converted to barracks for German troops. In an instant, the building was turned to rubble. Berlin was not pleased. They immediately called for the return of their chief government administrator in Denmark, plenipotentiary Werner Best, who has read the riot act. Best was relieved of his duty and temporarily replaced by the German military commander in Denmark. In addition, a state of emergency was declared in the nation, and the Danish parliament was given a list of demands that included an end to all public gatherings, curfews, the establishment of tribunals to deal with infringements of these rules. In addition, the Germans ordered the roundup of scores of Danish leaders, including military, political, and intellectual figures, all to be imprisoned in camps outside of Copenhagen. Among these were leaders of the Jewish community of Copenhagen, including the chief rabbi of the great synagogue, Rabbi Max Friediger. These were demands that the Danish parliament could not abide. Members not only voted to reject the German dictates, but to dissolve the body because it now had no purpose within the occupation. In support of these actions, King Christian declared himself a prisoner of war and retired to the castles for the duration. For the remaining year and a half of World War II, Denmark functioned without a government. There is much more to tell, but I'm going to fast forward. A little more than a month after the state of emergency was declared, Germany finally found its Jewish problem in Denmark too much to bear and ordered a roundup of all Jews in the nation, beginning on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in late September of that year. There began the most famous rescue of the Jews, in which spanned a mere 3 weeks. Almost the entire population of Jews in the nation, more than 95%, were able to escape Sweden by way of the Øresund, the strait that separates the two countries. Here are a few of the people who are also featured in the story. Niels Bohr was a world-famous Danish physicist who escaped from Copenhagen during the escape. His mother was Jewish, and he felt a need to protect his Jewish compatriots and help get them out of Denmark, and he himself escaped in the same process, only to go on and work for the Allies on production of the first nuclear bomb. Leo Goldberg was a 15-year-old boy who was at the Rosh Hashanah service, in which the rabbis informed the congregation in the great synagogue that it was time to leave the city. He was annoyed because he had his father, a cantor at the synagogue, had insisted he come to help fulfill a quorum for the service, which required Jewish adult males. He had just been bar mitzvahed, and so he was asked by his father to join and bring in a quorum. This is one of the very few pictures of the escape. I don't want to go into great detail about the escape. There's really too much to tell. Many of them traveled in fishing boats, or any kind of conveyance, floating conveyance that they could find. Here's one of the very few photographs that exists of that actually happening. These are Jews in Sweden after the fact. They have been rescued, which explains both the background and the lack of dress in their postures. You remember Henny Sinding, the young woman who was a sailing champion. This is the Gerda, which was a boat that she helped fill with escaping Jews who were subsequently taken across the strait to Sweden. This is Bente Keeler, the youngest sister, a second generation of Holgerdans. The first one, after the explosion, kind of disintegrated, but there was a second one which featured John Svend Otto Nielsen, and the flame, he was an assassin in the cause. Jorgen Staffeld was a leader of HD2, which was the second generation of the Holger dance group, of which Jorgen Keeler and Fleming Keeler became stalwart members too. Jorgen Staffelt and Jorgen Keeler, along with Fleming and actually they became concentration camp victims and went to Germany and suffered mightily for the cause. These are the white buses, some of the white buses at the end of the war. Scandinavian camp victims were loaded into white buses and escorted back to Denmark and Norway and Sweden. Here's a picture of me seated before the Holger dance statue in the basement of Kronborg Castle, which is the famous Hamlet Castle in Denmark. Holger dance is featured at the castle in this basement statue. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Where are you joining us from today?
I am in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh, good. Is it winter there yet?
No, it's not. We're having sort of actually late summer weather. It's been kind of warm this week.
So, fantastic presentation, and I have a lot of questions, and I think we're going to hopefully have a fair few from our audience. We have a really good audience today. So, the first thing that I really wanted to ask you is, what's special about Denmark? 99% of the Jews in Denmark were saved. What's special about Denmark as compared to every other occupied country that the Nazis, where they liquidated the Jewish populations? What's special about Denmark?
Well, that very question is what drove me towards this subject, and to be frank, I had not looked deeply at Danish history before, and I was when I decided to do this book, I had done a book about the resistance in the Netherlands, and was looking to do another resistance story from a country that hadn't been looked at in that regard very closely, and I knew just vaguely about the rescue of the Danish Jews, and I thought, well, that's interesting, and started to research it, and as I said, the first question that came to mind is what is special about Denmark, and you know, I think if I can propose an answer, I think that it's that they had a deep appreciation for these civil liberties that I talked about early on in the presentation. They really believed in the importance of civil liberties, and they thought it was wrong that Jews, having been granted citizenship in the country, should be treated any differently than the rest of the Danish citizens.
Was there any kind of history of anti-Semitism within Denmark?
Nothing as fierce as it was in other countries. I think part of that is because the population of Jews was so small. As a typically cynical journalist, I shouldn't put it that way. As a skeptical journalist, I have a hard time. I don't want to give credence to too much to the special nature of populations. My instinct is to say, well, it can't be quite like that. It can't be so wonderful as that. But I think that I've become a convert to the special nature of Danish citizenship.
Can you tell us what the situation was when the Germans went into Denmark? Because it seems to me that there was a clear decision made to accommodate the Nazis, tell us about the results of that and how that came about.
It came about because it prevented what would happen when what was a superpower in that world uh, chooses to overrun your small under defended nation. And the thinking was among the leadership of Denmark was that anything that we do is going to be met with an overwhelming force will just cause death and destruction to our citizens. And they kind of allowed it to happen without fighting. As I mentioned, Norway, on the other hand, which was very similar in its nature to Denmark, and even sharing brothers as the monarchs of the nation. Norway's was Hakan, and Denmark's was Christian, but they were blood brothers, but they had Norway put up a rather stiff resistance at the outset of the German occupation of that country. Denmark didn't, and as I said, that was not everyone, as I tried to indicate, not everyone, of course, went along with this stance as was indicated, but that was what the government and the king decided to do in the initial run up.
Do you think it's possible to characterize a nation by its actions in World War II? So, for example, Sweden, neutral, Norway, a phenomenal record of resistance against the Nazis. It was one of the few places in Europe where the Nazis never had full control. And then Denmark, a small country right on the border of Germany. Do you think it's wrong for me to try and make any kind of assumptions about the culture and nature of a people given their record in World War II? I'm a huge fan of the Norwegians, and not so much a fan of Swedish neutrality or any neutrality in World War II.
Well, I think I think that your attitude is typical of what many of the Allies felt during World War II. They didn't appreciate what Sweden was doing, and they didn't appreciate what Denmark was doing. And that was actually for the people, the Danish resistors, that was a consideration too, because they did not want to have when the resistance began to grow. It was in part because they saw the end of the war coming, and they didn't want to be on the wrong side when it came time to total up who did what, and they wanted to be sure that they were considered on the Allied side when in fact many thought that they weren't.
I posted a couple of photographs. You obviously recognize the gentleman in the photograph. That's Werner Best.
Yes.
Can you tell a little, what did you find out about Werner Best? Because I think he's a very interesting story. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he sort of lived in a. I think he kept his cards quite close to his vest. He was not someone who was the most overt kind of anti-Semitic leader in the Nazi world. Yet he tried to walk a fine line by keeping on Hitler's good side, while he also made overtures to Danes who were interested in this is speaking primarily of the Jewish issue. He made overtures to Danes who were interested in protecting their Jewish population, protecting their own civil liberties in Denmark.
So just to clear this up, he's the head of the Gestapo in
In France,
Nazi-occupied Denmark, and that's from like summer of 1943, around there, right
yeah,
until the end of the war.
yeah.
Um, is there any truth to his claim and other people's claims that he turned a blind eye to the small ships and the evacuation of the Jewish population from Denmark? Is there any truth to that at all, or is he just covering his backside later on in the?
A little again. This is where he sort of rides both sides of the issue. There's truth to the fact that there was not there was not a real diligent effort on the part of Germany to capture or prevent the escape of Jews from Denmark. Particularly talking about there was an impression all along that the Øresund was filled with German ships and boats trying to prevent the escape of these fishing vessels. The fact of the matter is, most of the German Navy was occupied with other chores during that period. They were looking up in the Kattegat and in the North Sea for Allied incursions. They had other concerns. They were also with all of the fishing boats. It happened to be the height of herring season and so along with the boats escaping with refugees, there were many fishing boats just out working in the sound, and so there were too many of these small ships to be stopped on a consistent basis by the German Navy. And to top it off, the German Navy had always thought that they would get help from the Danish Coast Guard in apprehending those boats in any circumstances like this. The Danish Coast Guard was simply not interested in working with the Germans to stop those escaping refugees. So just there wasn't much effort, but it wasn't so much a policy as it was circumstances that caused the ability to get out of Dodge.
So, do you think it was as simple as the fact that there were so few Jews in Denmark that it really wasn't a high priority for the Nazis?
It wasn't, to be frank. And one of the quotes that there was a character named Duckwitz who was a good friend of Werner Best and who was the head of the shipping for Germany during the war and became actually an actual ally to the cause of the German escape. Duckwitz quotes Best as saying at one point in their relationship, if we could have built a bridge over Øresund to allow the Jews to escape, that would have been fine with me. Meaning that they had the Germans would have had an easier time if they just allowed the Jews in Denmark to just escape over to Sweden without any effort on their part. It would have pleased the Jews, pleased the Danes, and would have pleased Berlin just to have them gone.
So, I guess it was fortunate for the Danes, particularly the Danish Jews, that they had Werner Best there for the good part of 2 years, because this is a very highly trained Nazi mind. This is a lawyer, a very good lawyer. He helped conceptualize and then carry out Nazi law so that when we end up with the Nazi Party totally dominating German society, he's one of the minds that allow them to do that legalistically. He's a ruthless man.
Mm-hmm.
Night Along Knives, 1934, gets rid of the SA. So this guy is both brilliant and ruthless. Also heavily involved in the Einsatzkommandos on the Eastern Front. So no problem with thousands and thousands of women and children being shot in the back of the head and dumped into pits on the Eastern Front. But in Denmark, he seems to have a soft touch. Maybe they're too Aryan. Maybe there's something about Denmark that he likes a little bit more than the Ukraine or elsewhere where mass atrocities occurred in his name.
You're informing me of you're informing me of things I didn't know, and I appreciate that. What you're saying could be very true. I just can't confirm it.
Okay, so another character that comes out of your book is Flame. Can you tell us about Flame? Because this guy's an extraordinary assassin.
Yeah,
11,
yeah.
11 kills with a partner of his. Can you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah, he was. I think I mentioned that he was part of the second generation of the Holger Dansk world. He was. I focus more on uh, different aspects of Holger Dansk, but he was. Uh, uh, he had he grew up he was the son of a hotel keeper who uh, uh, lived in Germany, and he developed a hatred for uh, Germans and German Nazis in particular. He came back to Denmark prior to the war, and hooked up with uh, uh, other of the more assassin oriented members of Holger Dansk, as opposed to the saboteurs. The Flame became a deep interest to the Nazis in time because of his assassinations, and he was in the story that I tell, he was sought after and became, when Jürgen Keeler was in his first prison in Denmark, and his first concentration camp. He was uh, interrogated again and again about the Flame. The Nazis became fixated on finding the Flame.
I've just posted a picture in the message.
Yeah, that's a sort of a
there
fierce.
he is.
That's how I envision him. He looks like a character out of a Marlon Brando movie.
So he killed 11 Germans in Denmark.
Did he?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And then he committed suicide by chomping down on a cyanide pill.
Yeah, he was at his girlfriend's house, and the Nazis were down. The Gestapo was down below, and he was not going to be taken by them. So,
okay, we have a bunch of questions. Dan says, I've seen a Danish rescue boat preserved at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Are there any other boats that have been preserved and are on display in other locations, museums?
yeah. In fact, the picture of the boat the Gerda 3 is at the Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, and it too was. I say that, and it's going to be there. It was there, but it's gone back and forth between the museum in Manhattan, the Jewish Museum in South Manhattan, and the Mystic Sea Harbor. They kind of share the boat for wherever their exhibits are being shown at any given time.
Okay, so we have another question from Mike, who often asks questions. Thank you, Mike. What is the background to the story, true or not, that when Jews were ordered to wear the Star of David, the king himself was seen wearing it? Is there any truth to that?
It's a myth. It's part of the lionization of the Christian 10 that happened during the war. He was he no Jews in Denmark wore the yellow star to begin with. That was part of the stipulation initially. It was and that held true throughout the World War II. And it developed the myth. I don't know exactly when the myth evolved, but it was there were also stories about Christian saying in a bold way when asked by some German official, "What are you going to do about the Jewish problem in your country?" And he was alleged or supposed to have said, "There is no Jewish problem in our country." And again, that was supposed to be an indication of his stalwart defense of Jews. And there's little evidence that he actually said those words. But as I've mentioned, he was widely admired because it was part of this sort of patriotism that evolved in response to the fact that Denmark had been overwhelmed essentially by the German occupation, and they needed some response.
Was there any criticism of the Danish royal family after the war, when I should be careful, when their so-called friends, I guess that would be a very prejudiced way of saying it. Was there any criticism of the behavior of the Danish royal family after the war?
It was the royal family was linked so closely to the government response that I don't think there was. There nothing that stood out. I think what evolved, and it's interesting that the response of Denmark and the immediate aftermath of the war, the response towards what the Danes had done was actually quite positive. The sense was that Denmark, the government had preserved Denmark as best they could, and they had kept their words on keeping the Danish people safe from the bloodshed that they had envisioned. The sense was they'd also done much to save the Jews. So it was the thinking was, the initial response was that we set out to preserve our civil liberties and protect our Jewish population and to keep the country safe. All of those things were essentially achieved. And if there are snipes from allied people about how we achieve that, so be it.
I'm sure the Irish, the Swedish, the Swiss, the Portuguese all feel the same. We have another question from David Trail. Thanks for joining us yet again, David. Was the German high command both in Denmark and in Germany Um, did they express any noticeable frustration with the situation in Denmark? Were the Germans frustrated about what was going on in Denmark?
I think so. This might sound contradictory to what I was saying about Werner Best and the bridge to allow the Jews to escape. In Berlin, Hitler's annoyance with the Jews remained throughout, and it grew as the sort of sabotage and troubles in Denmark grew through the course of the war. His anger at the fact that the very existence of the Jews in Denmark was real, I think, so but but again, I'm going to put a little proviso on that because for all that, there was never a crushing movement through Denmark made by the Germans. Even when the roundup began, there was it was not this sort of concerted effort to look in every nook and cranny for evidence of Jews that it might have been elsewhere. It was to be frank, it turned out to be sort of a half-hearted effort as far as German efforts at rounding up Jews was concerned.
Another question here from Colin. Were there any violent protests when Germany invaded Denmark? And if so, how did the Germans respond? Great question, Colin.
There were none. In Denmark, there was nothing. There was there was no immediate resistance, no immediate movement. It was all Denmark. It should be remembered was the first of the countries in Western Europe to be invaded, and so there were, despite the sense by many people, particularly the young people of Denmark, that this was wrong. There was never a pre-existing movement to prevent what was about to happen, which was Germany occupying the nation. So there was no groundwork laid prior to the invasion. So it just happened. People were stunned, and the government allowed it to happen. They agreed to the stipulations made by the Germans, and life went on. And the fact of the matter was that it was a tolerable existence for the Danes who were left behind. You had German troops tromping around and being bothersome, but there were no terribly oppressive actions taken by the Germans in the initial few months after the occupation. So there was nothing to prompt large-scale demonstrations. Or
how do you yourself feel, Tim, about the whole idea of neutrality in World War II? Do you think it's morally justifiable looking back when you think about what other nations who did have the gumption to resist, small nations included? Do you think there's still, how do you feel about that? Does it make you feel uncomfortable when you look at what happened in Switzerland, Denmark,
to be honest, the hero of my book, if I can designate him so is Jürgen Keeler, who was a Dane who never was satisfied with his country's response to, and who was a fierce anti-German, anti-Danish government throughout the war, and served and paid a very steep price for his actions. And he was And was a beyond that, he was just an admirable figure. He was he survived the war, but he and his brother, all of his whole family served time in camps during the war. He and his brother Fleming went to the hardest of hardcore camps in Germany, and survived and finally came home on the white buses. And both of them went on to become doctors, and Keeler was he is a genuine hero of the Danish people today, but he's also a hero in the sense that he was on the Danish resistance side of the story, which is there's another aspect of these issues that continues to this day, and between Danes who still sort of think that they followed a decent policy during World War II, and Danes who subscribed to well, we should have all been resistors during the war. Keeler was on that side of the fence.
What was the population of Denmark during the war?
Oh, that's a very good question that I don't have on the top of my head. It wasn't, it's not a huge populous country, a populated country, and it remains. I spent quite a bit of time in Copenhagen doing the research for the book, and I always was struck by how compact and small Copenhagen was, anyway.
One last question. From Wesley, did the Germans loot artworks from museums, from homes? How did they consider the unusual stark portrayals by Wilhelm Hammershøi? And there's a portrait there. Can you see it in the messaging?
I don't.
Did they loot artworks from museums? Did they go on?
I don't know. I'm going to hazard a guess that would suggest if they took artwork, it was a very minimal theft compared to other European sources. And I would say that for the most part, that culturally, the Germans did not do an oppressive overhaul of Danish institutions. You should remember that people should remember that the Danish government, for at least the first 3 years of the occupation, was essentially on an equal par with the occupying powers. The Danes pretty well controlled their own lives, and so it wasn't allowed for the Germans to whisk in and upheave everything.
Well, Tim, we're running out of time. Thanks for joining us. I urge everybody to read your wonderful book. I'm just going to show it here again so everyone gets a really good look. Thank you for your time. I know it takes your time in the week and then to appear with us today. We're very, very grateful. We'd love to have you in Washington, D.C. We had a great reaction to your presentation. All the best, and thank you
so much. This has been, I appreciate being on. Thank you, Alex.